Go against me, and we'll get a divorce, you parasite.
Silence filled the room. Sean looked up at the ceiling as if to say, "It's over." And as for me,
Hey, why are you laughing? That's creepy.
oh really? Did I look like I was laughing? For some reason, I had a smile on my face. I could feel it myself. My cheeks were twitching, and I knew exactly what kind of intense emotion was lurking behind that smile. Without saying a word, I stood up and handed Greg the paper I had hidden on the shelf. No, I let it flutter down from above his head. The moment it caught his eye, Greg's face changed color.
Hey, this.
Yeah, let's go ahead and divorce. I've already moved into $1 million mansion. At that moment, Greg's face looked like he'd been hit with a ton of bricks. Slowly, he repeated the word I had just said.
$1 million?
My name is Kate Johnson. I'm 57 years old, a housewife. I married Greg when I was 25, and 2 years later, at 27, I gave birth to our son, Sean. So Greg and I have been together for over 30 years now. Our only son, Sean, is happily married to a lovely woman named Samantha. I don't know much about Samantha's parents. Greg came up with all kinds of excuses not to meet them.
What's the point of meeting his spouse's parents? That's so old-fashioned nowadays.
Apparently, Samantha's father is the CEO of a company, and Greg, being just an employee, must have felt inferior, which is why he stubbornly refused to meet him. Sean got married at the same age I did, at 25. He and Samantha have now been married for 5 years. During that time, Samantha's mother passed away. Her funeral was held for family only, as per their wishes. Sean attended, and I prayed for Samantha's mother from afar. Though Sean and Samantha have only been married for 5 years, they already have 5 children. Their eldest are boy-girl twins, born at the same time they got married, so they're now 5 years old. Next is their daughter, who's 4, then their second son, who's 2, and recently they had their third son, just a newborn. It's rare to see a couple with so many children these days. As for me, my grandchildren mean the world to me, and each time I heard news of a new birth, I was overjoyed. But Greg, acting as if it were someone else's business, only ever said, "Oh, is that so?" Now, one day.
We're looking forward to staying with you.
Wait, what? Suddenly, Sean's entire family showed up at our house. But Sean isn't the type to drop by unannounced like this. Samantha even brought a gift, which made it clear. Greg must have done something behind my back. Suppressing the urge to sigh, I invited the 7 of them inside. Our house isn't very big. We built it when I was 40, and we're still paying off the mortgage. We designed it with our retirement in mind, so there aren't many rooms. For now, I decided to let Sean and his family use the 2 rooms upstairs. Samantha seemed worried. She must have noticed the serious look on my face and sensed something was wrong. I quickly put her at ease. "Samantha, I love having you and your kids here, so of course you're welcome. It's just that I wasn't told anything about this. You guys didn't do anything wrong, so make yourselves at home for now. I'll bring some snacks up for the kids in a bit." Samantha hesitantly thanked me. I stayed downstairs and approached Sean, who looked uncomfortable. "Your dad told you to come, didn't he?" Before Sean could answer, Greg, lying on the sofa with a drink, chimed in.
Yeah, I invited them. I told Sean you were feeling lonely and that we should all live together. You know, Samantha's on maternity leave, so money's tight. And now with her mom gone, I figured they could lean on you
Well, that part wasn't wrong, so I didn't correct him. But I wanted to hear Sean's feelings, so I asked him again. Sean, did you and Samantha really want to live with us? Sean hesitated before answering softly.
We've got 5 kids now, but I'm not home much because of my work. When Samantha heard about this from Dad, she said if it was okay with the two of you, she'd be willing to live together. The apartment we're in has gotten really cramped, and on top of that, the local government told us we need to move because of a new development.
It seemed like the timing worked out for them. I understand. If you and Samantha are fine with it, then I have no problem. Let me just have a word with Greg. Could you head upstairs and wait for me? Sean looked apologetic for a moment, but he did as I asked and went upstairs. Once I heard the door close, I glared at Greg. Why did you invite them without asking me? Greg, unfazed, calmly responded.
You would have just said no, right? You've become such a nagging old lady. Besides, I did them a favor. You should be grateful. You were lonely too, so it worked out, didn't it?
That wasn't the point I was trying to make. If he had properly discussed it with me, we could have at least made some preparations. Instead, he went ahead with everything without saying a word. Suspecting he had an ulterior motive, I pressed him, and Greg finally admitted, sounding annoyed.
It's about money. I told them if they want to live in my house, they need to chip in $1,000 a month for living expenses. Their apartment was costing them $700 a month, so $1,000 to live here is a bargain. I was just looking out for Sean and Samantha. You should have suggested it, but you're too clueless to think of these things.
Greg proudly puffed up his chest, acting as if he were the head of the household. He had no idea how much I'd sacrificed to get us to this point. Fine, I get it. I realized there was no point in continuing our conversation, so I quickly dropped the subject. The truth is, I cover most of our living expenses. Greg spends recklessly, and on his days off, he drinks as much as he possibly can. On top of that, he's a heavy smoker, and the amount of money he spends on cigarettes each month is likely outrageous. I'm not a stay-at-home wife. I work, but that seems irrelevant to him. To him, being a man and working for a company automatically makes him the head of the household. That's all he wants to believe. Recently, he mentioned that his bonus was smaller due to the company's poor performance. But I'm sure it was still a decent amount. He just wants to spend more on alcohol, cigarettes, and his own entertainment. So, in his brilliant scheme, he decided to invite Sean and his family to live here so he could squeeze them for living expenses. Currently, Greg only pays the mortgage while I cover all the utility bills, groceries, and everything else. He's almost completely unaware of this reality. I almost let out a sigh at how ridiculous Greg was being, but then I looked at my grandchildren, and suddenly, none of it seemed to matter. If anything, I wanted to enjoy living with Sean and his family. So I decided to shift my mindset and make the most of it. 3 months had passed since Sean and his family moved in. It was a regular day off, and Greg was, as usual, drinking in the middle of the day. When he ran out, he yelled at me.
Hey, I told you to keep the house stocked with booze. You're useless. That's why I can't stand having a good-for-nothing old lady like you around.
Drunken Greg shouted at me, saying he had run out of alcohol. Even with Sean, Samantha, and especially our grandchildren present, he didn't care at all. His outbursts continued.
A burden on society like you should at least show some respect to your husband. All you can do is like that to me because you're completely useless. Stop acting high and mighty when you barely even work.
Hearing this from a 58-year-old man was deeply saddening. Sean, seeing his father like this for the first time, looked horrified. Samantha sat with her head down, clearly uncomfortable. Greg's insults were aimed at me, but some of them probably struck a chord with her as well. Enough. Do you even realize your grandchildren are here? You're drunk and acting disgracefully. I snapped at Greg, but it only made him angrier.
Shut up. Have you ever earned as much as I have? You've lived off my income for years while working part-time, and now you have the nerve to lecture me? You're a burden, and everyone knows it. Right, Samantha? Isn't it awful to have such a useless mother-in-law?
Suddenly dragged into the conversation, Samantha was visibly uncomfortable. There's no way she could agree with Greg, but at the same time, she couldn't exactly disagree either. I felt a deep sense of shame for my husband, and just as I was about to scold him again,
Useless. Worthless. You're just an old lady who's past her prime. The women at my office are so much more attractive and charming. There's no comparison.
this wasn't new. Greg had been belittling me while drunk ever since Sean moved out. But for some reason, today I couldn't stand it any longer. Maybe it was because Sean and my grandchildren were here. My heart ached, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. I decided, once and for all, to confront Greg. I've tolerated your behavior for long enough without saying anything. Everyone in the living room turned to look at me, startled by my sudden outburst. I glanced at Samantha, and she gave a small nod before quietly taking the children upstairs. She's such a thoughtful person, I admired. I slowly turned my gaze back to Greg. He looked utterly confused, as if he had no idea what I was trying to say.
What are you talking about all of a sudden? I don't think I've ever forced anything on you.
Hearing those words, I realized my body was trembling with my anger. Why hadn't I said something sooner? I glanced up and met eyes with Sean, who was watching me with a worried expression.
Mom, well,
It was at that moment I finally understood. I had endured Greg's terrible treatment for all these years for Sean's sake. I'd been willing to sacrifice myself, living every day like that, and before I knew it, more than 20 years had passed. It seemed I had finally reached my breaking point, a point where I couldn't even control my emotions. Greg, oblivious to the situation, yawned and scrolled through his phone, then reached for a bag of chips and began munching noisily. Something snapped inside me. Why was I still married to this man? Sean had grown up, found a wonderful wife, Samantha, and had 5 beautiful children. I had endured it all for the sake of my son. But now that Sean was independent, there was no reason for me to keep this marriage going. Suddenly, a strange laugh bubbled up from inside me. Yes, I've grown so used to enduring, haven't I? It became second nature, like it was just normal. But I don't have to endure anymore. As I started muttering to myself, Greg looked at me with suspicion. Then he yelled at me.
What's with you? You're freaking me out. And hey, where's my booze? And go get me some more snacks while you're there.
Dad, that's enough. Don't you understand the situation right now?
Sean's voice didn't reach Greg, who was drunk and feeling bold. Then Greg said the one thing he should never have said.
Go against me, and we'll get a divorce, you parasite.
Silence fell over the room. Sean looked up at the ceiling as if to say, "It's over." And as for me,
What? Why are you laughing? You're creeping me out.
oh, really? Did I look like I was laughing? Somehow, I was smiling. I could feel it. My cheeks were twitching uncontrollably. and I knew exactly what kind of intense emotion was hiding behind that smile. Without a word, I stood up and handed Greg the paper I had hidden in the shelf. No, I let it flutter down over his head. As soon as it caught his eye, Greg's face changed.
Hey, what's this?
Fine, divorce it is. I've already moved into $1 million mansion. At that moment, Greg's face looked like he'd been hit by a ton of bricks. Slowly, he repeated the word I had just said.
$1 million?
I've been wondering when to bring it up, but this was the perfect moment, one I'd never get again. So, I raised my voice and said it again. You said if I go against you, we'll get divorced, right? You said you'd kick me out of this house, right? Because this house is in your name, after all. The one with the mortgage is still hanging over your house. Fine, I'll leave. I'll divorce you just like you wanted. I was shocked by how loud and deep my voice had become. Greg stood there, dumbfounded, staring at me in disbelief, as if his once submissive wife had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. The silence stretched on, and finally he swallowed hard and yelled back.
Have you lost your mind? You've been a stay-at-home wife under my care this whole time, with no value whatsoever. And now you're talking about $1 million? You don't even know the value of money, you idiot.
He slammed his hand on the table, making a loud noise, as if trying to intimidate me. Don't you dare underestimate me. I slammed my hand down in the same way, and Greg flinched, his shoulders jerking as he blinked rapidly. Just as I was about to lose myself in my anger, Sean stepped between us.
Calm down, Mom.
Greg, seeing that Sean was trying to soothe me and not him, gave a smug, triumphant look.
Look at that. How embarrassing. A woman over 50 getting calmed down by her son. What a joke.
Clearly still drunk, Greg kept spouting nonsense, but Sean cut him off with a calm voice.
I just said something because I'm worried about Mom.
Greg's eyes widened in shock, as if Sean had just slapped him with those words. Sean continued.
And yes, Mom really did move into that $1 million house. She's been wondering when to tell you. Honestly, I don't think she ever intended to keep it a secret. There were times when she was on the phone with a real estate agent and the documents were right there. The fact that you didn't notice is on you, Dad.
Greg shrunk in his seat, clearly deflated by Sean's pointed remarks. I'd never tried to hide anything about the house. There had been plenty of signs, but Greg never paid any attention to what I was doing. And about the whole support thing, you didn't even realize I've been off your support for years now, did you? I know you've never filled out a document about taxes, so you never know. Greg had never cared about politics, economics, or anything remotely complicated. Or rather, he avoided them because he couldn't understand them. When Greg was younger, he worked at a company where taxes weren't automatically deducted, so he fell behind on paying his local taxes and health insurance. And when we got married, I found out about his debt and the unpaid bills, which I cleared up using my savings. I did it because I loved him, because I wanted to help him. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be treated like this after over 30 years of marriage. If I'd known, I never would have married you, and I wouldn't have paid off your debt. But I can say it clearly now. The only person I really needed was Sean. I couldn't stand seeing Sean upset, so I went along with your controlling attitude. But it's all over now. With that, I let out everything I've been holding in for years. I loved you, so I paid off your debt. I loved you, so I paid for our entire wedding. I gave up my career to stay home because you wanted me to. And I endured all the cruel things you said. just so Sean could grow up in a stable home with both his parents. But today, with your behavior, I finally reached my limit. Greg's face twitched, his expression stiff.
Wait a minute. Isn't this a little sudden?
You're quick to lose your temper, so you probably don't get it. But people who don't normally get angry just bottle it up. Everyone has a breaking point. I've been holding back for years, enduring your mistreatment. But today, your actions finally pushed me over the edge. You know the saying, no use crying over spilled milk. Greg seemed to finally grasp the gravity of the situation, and he started to apologize.
Wait. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was pushing you this far. But can you explain something? $1 million? You don't have that kind of money.
I thought for a moment that he might actually be remorseful, but of course, he was only interested in the money. I let out an exaggerated sigh and glanced over at Sean. Sean seemed to catch on and spoke to Greg, his tone tired and exasperated.
Remember when Grandpa passed away 2 years ago and you didn't go to his funeral?
Well, that was...
That day, when Greg's father died, he dumped his responsibility of the funeral on me, saying he had an important business deal and couldn't take time off. He told me to just handle it.
That was beyond disrespectful. I know you and Grandpa didn't have the best relationship, but when your parent passes, you show up and say goodbye. That's just what you do. Grandpa's will said the funeral was for immediate family only, so none of the relatives knew you didn't come.
After saying that, Sean clenched his fist, visibly upset. I remember that day clearly too. Greg's father, a widower, had raised Greg all by himself, and I respected my father-in-law as a parent. So when Greg chose his job over his father's funeral, I was stunned. We couldn't postpone the funeral, so I stepped in as the host, and it was just me, Sean, Samantha, and my grandkids. And even then, he said something so callous in front of his father's house. When we visited Greg's childhood home to sort out his father's belongings after the funeral, he said something I'll never forget.
Hey, do you think I can sell my dad's old house?
It was always about money with Greg. I was too shocked to even respond. But that's just the kind of man Greg was, completely oblivious to everything.
By the way, what happened with the inheritance? I mean, if he lived in a dump like this, there probably wasn't much of anything left, right? There were no stories about him making a fortune or anything. You just handle it all for me, will you? I don't have the time or energy for that.
After that, Greg never brought up his father again. When I sold the land where his father's house once stood and handed Greg the money, he was over the moon. But there's more to that story. Since you are so curious about the $1 million, let me explain. It has to do with your father's inheritance. At that, Greg's eyes widened in shock, and his body language became animated in a way I had never seen before.
Wait, you're telling me my dad had that kind of inheritance? Why didn't anyone tell me? I'm his only heir.
You forgot that you waived your right to the inheritance, didn't you? Greg's loud outburst suddenly quieted down, and he seemed deep in thought, as if struggling to remember. I sighed again and walked over to the shelf. This time, instead of the divorce papers, I pulled out a different document and handed it to him. As soon as Greg looked at it, a frown creased his brow.
This, I think my dad's lawyer was.
Yes, it was the lawyer your dad appointed. You do remember, don't you? You had no interest in the inheritance and left everything to me. But because you were still technically the legal his heir, we discussed having you formally waive your inheritance rights, just in case. Greg swallowed hard, clearly starting to recall the conversation.
I guess we did talk about that. But if I had known there was $1 million involved, I wouldn't have waived anything.
I couldn't disagree with that. Greg, always so greedy when it came to money, would have clung to it if he'd known. But things were a bit different at that time, and Sean, who knew the full story, stepped in to fill in the gaps.
Because Dad waived his inheritance rights, they passed to me. But Grandpa's will clearly stated that he wanted everything to go to Mom, as she was the one who took care of him. Mom went through a lot, you know?
Sean was right. Greg had dumped all of his father's care on me, claiming it was the duty of a daughter-in-law.
That's why I also waived my rights, respecting Grandpa's wishes. That's when Mom inherited everything. At the time, the only cash left was about $10,000.
Greg's frown deepened even more. If there had only been $10,000, he must have been wondering where the $1 million came from. The truth lay in an unexpected place. Your father bought a house before he passed away. It was a designer house. He had a friend design it for him at a discounted price. But after your dad passed, the designer also passed away soon after. When that happened, the value of your dad's house skyrocketed. The designer had been famous in certain circles, and as word spread about the last home he ever designed, demand for it soared. The house became known as the final masterpiece of a renowned designer, and its value continued to climb. Although I had no immediate plans to sell it, real estate experts estimated its worth to be around $1 million. I had only researched the house out of curiosity because I kept receiving inquiries from people in the real estate world after word got out that I'd inherited it. After discussing it with a trusted friend in the industry, I decided not to sell and planned to move in. With Sean's family living with us, I had even considered passing the house on to him eventually. Then, as if he just had a brilliant idea, Greg suddenly spoke up.
Wait, hold on. If I waive my rights without knowing, can I still make a claim for my portion? There's something called legitimate portion, right?
Sean and I exchanged a knowing smile, which only seemed to frustrate Greg more. Sean spoke up, addressing him directly.
Dad, you already received the money from selling the land where Grandpa's house was.
Sean was right. You never bothered to learn about taxes or insurance. But when it comes to money coming in, you suddenly become an expert. We anticipated this. Back then, the designer was still alive, and your dad's house hadn't increased in value yet. The only assets were the $10,000 in cash and the land the house stood on. That was the entirety of the inheritance. My lawyer and me calculated everything. Just in case you tried to claim your legitimate portion later, we set aside your share and gave it to you back then. Sean, who works in a large company's legal department and is currently a paralegal, explained this to Greg, who still seemed unable to comprehend the situation.
We calculated the value of the designer house at the time, sold the land where Grandpa's house stood, and determined how much you'd owe if you tried to claim your inheritance portion. It turned out to be exactly the same amount as the money you got from the land sale. That means you've already received your portion of the inheritance, Dad. So, no matter how much you complain now, there's nothing more for you to get.
Greg's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected that I had taken care of things so far in advance, 2 years ago. I knew exactly how Greg had spent those hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had kept quiet about it all this time, but now my patience was wearing thin, and everything I had bottled up began to spill over like a broken dam. You remember how, during your dad's funeral, You kept going on about work and business deals. The truth is, that was just an excuse. It overlapped with the time your mistress was giving birth, didn't it? That's why you didn't show up. The next moment, Greg gasped and then sat down on the floor.
You knew everything? You knew, and you stayed silent?
As I've said before, I had wanted to keep our family together. I had pretended not to know because I thought it was the best way to preserve what we had. But over time, the weight of my feelings built up without me realizing it, and my tolerance finally reached its limit. Yes, I knew. Your affair partner is a young woman in her 20s, right? She's on maternity leave now and pregnant with your second child. She's taking advantage of the company's benefits as a single mother, isn't she? I'm sure she's enjoying herself with that. I doubt the company has any idea you're the father of her children. And I hear your second baby is due soon. Did you think I didn't know? You also spent the money from selling the family land on her, didn't you? Greg's face twisted with guilt, as if a sound effect should have accompanied his uncomfortable expression. I didn't want to discuss this in front of Sean. After all, for me, that woman's child and the one she's about to have are complete strangers. But for Sean, they're technically half-siblings. Yet Sean, much to my surprise, had grown into an admirable adult.
Wow, I'm shocked, but honestly, I can't say I'm surprised, Dad. You always seemed capable of something like this. Mom, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how much you've endured for my sake. I wish you had leaned on me more. I want to be here for you, just as you were always there for me. And as for what I just heard, I can't let that slide, Dad. Isn't that right, Samantha?
At some point, Samantha had come downstairs, and their kids were upstairs, distracted by the TV. She must have heard part of our conversation, especially about Greg's inappropriate behavior at work. Neither Greg nor I could figure out why Sean had brought Samantha into this. But soon, an unexpected truth came to light.
I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make things awkward. But, Dad, Samantha is the daughter of the CEO of your company.
What?
Greg turned his head towards Samantha with the awkwardness of a machine in need of oil. Her expression was icy cold.
Samantha works for a different company, so I doubt you've ever met her at work. You kept refusing to meet her parents, coming up with excuse after excuse. Well, that turned out to be your downfall. We had been saving up to finally have our wedding now that the kids are a bit older and life is more stable. But I've decided that we won't be inviting you.
As Sean finished speaking, Samantha walked outside, phone in hand, probably to inform her father of everything that had just happened. Greg, in a panic, tried to stop her, but Sean quickly restrained him, holding him back like a criminal caught by the police. Greg looked tortured, and I couldn't resist delivering the final blow. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention something earlier. Remember when I said I was no longer under your financial support? I've been working from home for a while now. It's not a huge amount, but I make about $3,000 a month. So, I don't need you anymore. I can stand on my own. Thank you for everything, and goodbye. My words were cold, dismissive. Greg reached out desperately for me, but his hand grasped only air. He would never reach me again. After this, Greg made a pathetic face and ran out of the house. He must have realized that he had no allies. Of course, before he left, I made sure to get his signature on the divorce papers. I went to the courthouse alone and filed for divorce, bringing our marriage to an official end. At last, everything had come to a close. It wasn't the absolute end, but it felt like a chapter had finally finished. and I let out a sigh of relief. From then on, Greg's life spiraled into disaster, or perhaps it was simply karma catching up to him. In the end, I heard that he left the company. Given his inappropriate relationship with his junior colleague, it was inevitable. Greg's mistress was soon sued by Samantha's father, the CO, for damages. Although it was true that she was a single mother, receiving financial support from Greg while also collecting company benefits under false pretenses was clearly fraudulent. With rumors spreading, she was forced to leave the company. I had already settled with her through proper compensation, and after that, I had no interest in her or how her life turned out. She had paid her dues, so I decided not to dwell on her any further. Even after she was out of the picture, there was no way Greg could walk the halls of the company with his head held high. Without a job, hit with the financial burden of paying me alimony, and having lost everyone's trust, he couldn't find another job either, or so I'd heard. He couldn't keep up with the mortgage on the house we once lived in and had to give it up. Eventually, I heard he ended up homeless, living on the streets. Rumor has it, he learned how to build a cardboard shelter from a homeless person and is now scraping by, exposed to the elements. Greg lost everything in a single day. Cut off from his son, divorced from me, estranged from his mistress and her child, and left with nothing to divide in the divorce. Having squandered most of what he had on his affair, there was nothing left for me to claim as marital property, and he ended up deeply in debt just to pay my alimony. But all of this was his own doing. This is the pitiful fate of a man who took his family for granted. As for me, I now live happily in the beautiful home left by Greg's father, surrounded by Sean, Samantha, and my 5 grandchildren. At first, I worried about being lonely in such a large house, but my concerns quickly vanished as the sound of the kids' laughter filled the space. I'm not a remarkable person, but I do have one thing to be proud of.
Mom, thank you for everything you've done.
At Sean and Samantha's wedding, I had the honor of stepping in for Samantha's late mother, performing the symbolic task of lowering her bridal veil. Watching this, Sean, overwhelmed with emotion, murmured his gratitude as he wiped away tears. Samantha also had tears in her eyes. I gently hugged them. Sean and Samantha, thank you. I'm so proud of you both. You're both my precious children. What I'm most proud of is that I have such a caring son, a wonderful daughter-in-law, and lively grandchildren. Nothing else compares.